The new beginning. The sun was still low in the sky as Melanie stepped off the bus, her heart racing as her gaze swept over the massive International Academy. The towering gates loomed before her, a symbol of the elite institution she was about to enter. She had dreamt of this moment for so long, her scholarship to Stanford, an achievement that not only reflected her brilliance but also promised a new chapter in her life. This was a prestigious school, one that molded the best of the best, and here she was, about to become part of it. For most, it would have been a dream come true. Yet, as Melanie stepped forward, there was an unfamiliar weight in her chest, a strange sensation that gnawed at her as she gazed at the grand entrance. She could hear the distant hum of chatter from the students that roamed the grounds, perfectly manicured, with the air of privilege all around them. The academy was nothing short of extraordinary, and yet, for all its grandeur, Melanie felt like a foreigner stepping into a world she didn't quite belong to. She had been a standout student back home, but this place was different. It was a kingdom in its own right, and she couldn't help but feel a little like a trespasser. As she walked toward the massive doors, she had a hard time shaking the feeling of being under a microscope. Her reputation preceded her. Everyone had heard about the new scholarship recipient, the brilliant newcomer from a small town who had shattered records with her academic achievements. But now that she was here, in the heart of the elite institution, she felt as though her accomplishments weren't enough to keep her from being swallowed by the vast sea of faces she was about to meet. Inside, the corridors were lined with golden plaques and portraits of past scholars, reminders of the institution's history of excellence. Everything was immaculate, the marble floors gleaming beneath the weight of polished shoes, and the hallways adorned with high-end art that whispered of status. Melanie felt out of place, her worn backpack in stark contrast to the designer bags she saw some students carrying. She tried to focus on her surroundings, the promise of a new start that lingered in her mind, but it was hard to ignore the subtle whispers she caught in the corners of her hearing. "That's her, the scholarship girl," a voice said, barely audible but sharp enough for Melanie to notice. Melanie's stomach twisted, but she kept walking, refusing to let the remark affect her. She wasn't here to prove herself to anyone but herself. She had come to this school with a purpose, to thrive, to grow, and to show everyone that intelligence could make all the difference. But the undercurrents of disapproval, whether imagined or real, made her feel more like a trophy being passed around for observation than a student starting her journey. Her first class was advanced calculus, a subject she had mastered with ease back home. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, knowing that her sharp mind would allow her to excel. Still, there was something about this classroom that made her uneasy. The students were different. They didn't share the same values or the same humbling background she had grown up with. They were polished, wealthy, and far more confident than she could ever hope to be. She took her seat quietly, noticing the hushed conversations that seemed to halt the moment she entered. Among the students sitting in the front row, Melanie noticed a girl with striking features, a sharp jawline, platinum blonde hair, and an aura of confidence that radiated from her as though it were a second skin. Blakely, she assumed. She had heard her name mentioned more than once in passing conversations. The girl who ran the school, the one who could easily charm her way into the hearts of everyone around her. Blakely turned her head as Melanie sat down, her piercing blue eyes locking onto hers for a moment longer than necessary. Melanie couldn't help but feel the weight of that gaze, the subtle challenge hidden in Blakely's smirk. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something in Blakely's posture suggested that the air between them had shifted, that Melanie's very presence had already created a disturbance in the status quo. "Great, another genius," Melanie overheard one of Blakely's friends whisper under her breath, though it was loud enough for Melanie to catch. This school was never about brains. She's just going to try to take everything from Blakely. Melanie felt the blood rush to her face, but she quickly masked her discomfort with a calm expression. She wasn't about to let anyone see how rattled she felt. Still, the words stung more than she cared to admit. She wasn't here to steal anything. She was here to carve out her own path, to earn her place, not to claim what wasn't hers. The professor entered the room, and Melanie quickly turned her attention to the lecture, hoping to focus on the equations that would provide her with an escape from the discomfort swirling in the air around her. For the next few hours, she submerged herself in numbers, graphs, and formulas, her mind working faster than she ever could have imagined. But as the class came to an end, she couldn't shake the feeling that Blakely's presence was still lingering in the room, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Melanie gathered her things slowly. She wasn't in any rush. This wasn't the time to make a dramatic exit, but it also wasn't the time to linger and make herself an easy target. She slipped out of the classroom quietly, letting the other students pass by her in a blur, their laughter and chatter filling the hallway. Blakely was there again, walking past with her entourage, her gaze sweeping across the room in a way that suggested she was used to being admired. But when she saw Melanie, her eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't overt, but it was unmistakable. Melanie had entered Blakely's domain, and she was not welcome. The moment passed quickly, but the sting of it stayed with Melanie for the rest of the day. Every step she took on the campus seemed heavy, as though the weight of expectation, both from her own accomplishments and from the unspoken judgment around her, was pressing down on her. As evening fell, Melanie found herself standing in front of her dorm room, staring at the door as though it were a barrier. She wasn't sure what she expected, perhaps a warm welcome, or at least a moment of peace where she could collect her thoughts. But as she walked inside, she realized that she wasn't alone. A note was left on her desk, scribbled hastily in what appeared to be a familiar handwriting. "Meet me in the garden at midnight." It was an odd invitation, and one that Melanie almost disregarded. But something about the note intrigued her, and against her better judgment, she found herself stepping out into the quiet night air. The garden was a secluded, serene space hidden away from the bustle of campus. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. And there, standing under the dim glow of a nearby lantern, was Blakely. For a moment, Melanie froze, unsure of what this encounter could mean. Blakely gave her a knowing smile, a far cry from the cold stares of earlier in the day. "I know who you are, Melanie," Blakely said, her voice low and almost too smooth. "And I'm not sure how long you think you can hide behind that scholarship of yours. You may have the brains, but here? It's more than that. You'll need something more if you're going to survive." Melanie's heart raced, her mind scrambling for a response. This was not the introduction she had imagined, and certainly not the warm welcome she'd hoped for. Blakely's words hung in the air, charged with meaning. It was clear now that this wouldn't be an easy road. But Melanie was no stranger to adversity. If anything, it only fueled her determination to prove herself, on her terms, in her way. The challenge had been set. The underlying tension. Days passed, and the undercurrent of tension that Melanie felt when she first arrived at International Academy only grew stronger. The initial excitement of being at the school faded into a more palpable sense of isolation. Despite her academic achievements and her bright future ahead of her, Melanie found it difficult to find her footing in this world that was so foreign to her. The whispers, the glances, the subtle side eyes, it was all becoming a bit too much. She had expected some degree of attention, of course. After all, she was the scholarship girl, the one who had earned a prestigious direct entry to Stanford based solely on her intellect. But what she hadn't anticipated was the resentment that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of the interactions she had with the other students. Blakely's cold, calculating stare from that night in the garden had made it clear, Melanie was no longer just a newcomer to this world, she was a target. But it wasn't just Blakely. The other students who had once been warm and friendly, at least outwardly, were now cautious around her, as if there were invisible lines they didn't want to cross. It was as if they knew, on some primal level, that Melanie's presence threatened the delicate balance of the academy's social fabric. Melanie felt like an outsider in every sense of the word. At first, she had hoped to blend in quietly and make her mark academically, thinking that her intellect alone would speak for itself. But blending in wasn't an option here. The world at International Academy wasn't driven by intelligence or merit alone. It was driven by power, influence, and status, things Melanie had never needed to pay much attention to before. She had come from a small town where she was well known and respected for her academic accomplishments, but at this school, she was just one face in a sea of others, each more polished and perfect than the next. The idea that she might be overshadowed, or worse, resented, by others was a harsh realization. In the classroom, Melanie excelled, as expected. Her grades were impeccable, her focus unwavering, and she quickly found herself at the top of her class, her name frequently mentioned as the one to watch. But as her academic accomplishments grew, so did the whispers in the hallway. Her fellow students would glance at her, talking just a little too loudly when they passed. "Who does she think she is?" they'd mutter. "She thinks she's better than us, but she doesn't know how things work here." Despite her success, it felt as though she was being pushed further and further away from the very thing that was supposed to bring her comfort, her intellect. She started to dread walking down the halls, knowing that each step she took was under the scrutiny of an invisible crowd. The isolation grew heavier with each passing day. And then, there was Blakely. Blakely's hostility toward Melanie wasn't subtle. It wasn't just in the moments where their gazes met, though that alone spoke volumes. It was in the little things. The way Blakely made sure her friends were always around whenever Melanie was near. The way she would laugh a little too loudly when Melanie answered a question in class, or how she'd make a sharp remark after Melanie finished an assignment, even though the work was flawless. At first, Melanie thought it was just a rivalry, the kind of thing that might happen when two people competed for the same spotlight. But soon, it became clear that this was no ordinary rivalry. Blakely wasn't simply threatened by Melanie's presence, she was actively working to undermine her at every turn. And her reach extended far beyond the classroom. It wasn't just the subtle jabs during class, either. Blakely had an entire social network of students, the ones who had been at International Academy for years. They were the ones who threw their weight around in the halls, the ones who held all the power at the school. And it was clear that Blakely had them wrapped around her finger. She wasn't just a student here, she was a queen, and everyone else was either a subject or an obstacle. One afternoon, as Melanie made her way to the cafeteria, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. "Did you hear about the new girl?" one of Blakely's friends said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You mean Melanie? She's such a joke," another voice chimed in. "She thinks she's special just because she got a scholarship. She's not like us. She doesn't get it. Blakely's the one who runs this school." Melanie's stomach churned at the words. She had known, deep down, that she was being watched, but hearing it spoken aloud made her feel more isolated than ever. What had she gotten herself into? She walked away quickly, trying to push the hurtful words to the back of her mind. But it wasn't easy. The more she heard these kinds of comments, the more she began to question her place here. The power dynamics were clear. Blakely was the ruler of this world, and Melanie was nothing more than an unwelcome distraction. She had no intention of giving up, of course. She wasn't going to let herself be driven out by the whispers of a few petty students. But every day, it felt like a battle. Despite the mounting pressure, Melanie tried to maintain her focus on her academics. But her success in the classroom only seemed to feed the fire of animosity. The more she excelled, the more the students around her seemed to resent her. The subtle hostility that Blakely wielded so expertly began to bleed into every aspect of Melanie's life. It was like trying to work in a room full of glass walls. There was no privacy, no space to breathe, and nothing she did went unnoticed. One evening, as Melanie sat in the library, her nose buried in her notes, trying to catch up on a particularly difficult subject, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Isn't it kind of funny?" one student asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Funny?" "What do you mean?" another replied. "Blakely's always so nice to her face, but you can tell she's not happy about the scholarship girl taking all the attention," the first student said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "You know how she works, she'll smile and act all sweet, but you can see the jealousy in her eyes. It's only a matter of time before she does something to put her in her place." Melanie's heart raced. It wasn't just the academic rivalry between her and Blakely. This was personal. This was about status, about power, and Blakely was not going to let her succeed without making her suffer for it. She slammed her textbook shut, unable to concentrate any longer. This was more than just a battle of brains, it was a battle of wills, and Melanie was starting to wonder if she had what it took to win. But despite the mounting pressure, she wasn't ready to give up. There had to be a way to stand her ground, to prove to herself, and to everyone else, that she wasn't going to be intimidated. She wouldn't be another pawn in Blakely's game. But the question was, how? The next few days passed in a blur, with Melanie continuing to navigate the delicate dance of surviving in a world where everyone seemed to have their own agenda. She knew she couldn't fight Blakely head-on, not yet, anyway. But she also knew that something needed to change, and quickly. Then, one morning, as she walked to her first class, something unusual happened. Blakely's usual entourage of followers wasn't surrounding her like a protective wall. In fact, Blakely herself was nowhere to be found. Melanie felt a flicker of curiosity, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she had an opportunity to breathe. But as the day wore on, the unsettling feeling in her gut only grew stronger. It was as though the calm before the storm had arrived. And this storm? It was going to hit harder than anything she had ever faced before. Melanie took a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever was to come. She had no idea what Blakely was plotting, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let this world of power and influence defeat her. Not without a fight. The shift. The weeks that followed brought with them a growing sense of tension, an unease that settled deep within Melanie's chest. Every day she walked the halls of International Academy, she could feel the invisible eyes on her, the judgment and subtle scorn that followed her every step. She had tried to keep her head down, to focus solely on her studies, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the fact that she had stepped into a world where success didn't just rely on talent, it relied on much more than that. Blakely's influence over the student body was undeniable. She had mastered the art of manipulation, her charm laced with just enough venom to keep those around her in line. Every interaction was calculated, every smile a weapon. She was the queen bee, the one who held the power, the one who dictated who was worthy of attention and who was not. And Melanie, for all her brilliance, was now squarely in her crosshairs. It wasn't just Blakely's overt hostility that made Melanie's life difficult, it was the way the entire social structure of the academy seemed to work. The students here were no longer the bright-eyed teenagers she had encountered in her small town. They were polished, crafted by years of social conditioning, and they all seemed to play a part in the game of status and power. Those who didn't fit in were discarded, ignored, or worse, manipulated. Melanie had seen it before in high school, the cliques and the subtle social warfare, but this was something else entirely. This was a game that no one had told her she was playing. The shift in Blakely's behavior was subtle at first, but impossible to miss once it became apparent. At first, she had tried to belittle Melanie in small ways, subtle jabs here and there, a flicker of disdain whenever their paths crossed. But as the days passed, Blakely's attacks became more direct, more personal. It was clear that she saw Melanie as a threat, and rather than letting the newcomer integrate into the school peacefully, Blakely set out to make her feel unwelcome, to undermine her every step. During group projects, Blakely would steer conversations in ways that put Melanie on the defensive. If there was a topic she excelled in, Blakely would be quick to brush it aside and suggest something that would challenge Melanie in a way that made her uncomfortable. If Melanie answered a question correctly, Blakely would feign disinterest and dismiss her response as too technical. It was as if Blakely wanted to erase any notion that Melanie belonged here, any idea that her success was earned and deserved. But it wasn't just in the classroom where Blakely waged her war. Melanie began to feel the sting of exclusion outside of class as well. In the cafeteria, the once friendly faces she had tried to approach now looked past her, sitting at tables that were always filled with Blakely's inner circle. Blakely's friends, who had initially been polite, now seemed to pretend she didn't exist. The isolation she felt grew sharper, like being surrounded by an invisible wall that no one dared to cross. It was as though Melanie were being quietly erased from the social fabric of the academy. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Melanie refused to fold. She had worked too hard to get here, and she wasn't about to let Blakely's petty games define her. It wasn't her fault that Blakely's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. Melanie was simply the catalyst. And if Blakely didn't like that, well, that wasn't her problem. But as Melanie spent more time observing the way the school operated, she began to see the cracks in Blakely's carefully crafted facade. There was something off about the way Blakely interacted with her friends, something more than just superficial charm. Blakely was controlling, manipulative, and it seemed that no one really had the courage to stand up to her. Melanie could see it in the way Blakely's so-called friends deferred to her every whim, the way they laughed at her cruel jokes, or the way they silently nodded in agreement when she spoke. It was clear that Blakely's power was based on fear, fear of being cast out, fear of losing their place in the hierarchy. The more Melanie observed, the more she began to formulate a plan. She wasn't going to fight fire with fire, not in the way Blakely expected. No, she had something else in mind. She would use the very thing that Blakely thought made her invincible, the loyalty of her friends, against her. But to do that, she would need to get closer to Blakely's inner circle, to infiltrate the group in a way that would allow her to gather information. Melanie wasn't naive enough to think that she could simply confront Blakely head-on and win. No, that would play into Blakely's hands. Instead, she would have to go about this quietly, strategically. Her first step was to observe more closely. She had already started to notice the cracks in the friendships around Blakely, but she needed more information, something concrete that she could use when the time was right. So, she began spending more time in the places where Blakely's friends hung out, like the cafeteria, the lounge, and even the gym after hours. She watched them closely, listening for signs of discord, for any weakness in Blakely's carefully curated empire. It wasn't long before she caught her first glimpse of the vulnerability she was searching for. One afternoon, while sitting alone in the library, Melanie overheard a conversation between two of Blakely's closest friends, Mia and Claire. Mia was tall, with dark brown hair and a sharp gaze that could cut through anyone who stood in her way. Claire, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved, but always seemed to fall in line behind Mia and Blakely. "She's getting out of hand," Mia was saying in a hushed tone, clearly trying to keep her voice down. "Blakely's pushing everyone too hard. I mean, it's like she doesn't care about anyone anymore, just about keeping control. It's like she's scared." "I know," Claire responded, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been noticing it too. She's been different. More desperate, maybe. Like, she's doing everything she can to stay on top. But she's losing it. People are starting to talk, Mia. I don't know how much longer she can keep this up." Melanie's heart skipped a beat. Here it was, the opening she needed. Blakely's hold on her friends, on the school itself, wasn't as unshakable as it appeared. She was starting to lose control. The cracks were widening, and Melanie now had a chance to exploit them. But this wasn't something she could do alone. She needed an ally, someone who could help her navigate the social intricacies of this world. And then it hit her, her twin sister, Alyssa. Alyssa was everything Melanie wasn't, outgoing, confident, and able to charm anyone she met. While Melanie had always preferred to stay in the background, Alyssa thrived in the spotlight. It had never been an issue before. They had always complemented each other, balancing out each other's strengths and weaknesses. Now, Alyssa was the key to Melanie's plan. The more Melanie thought about it, the more she realized how perfect this could be. Alyssa could infiltrate Blakely's inner circle with ease, using her charm to win over the students who were beginning to grow weary of Blakely's control. Once inside, Alyssa could help Melanie gather the information they needed to finally take Blakely down. But convincing Alyssa would be another matter. Alyssa had always been hesitant about getting involved in anything that didn't feel right. She didn't like drama or confrontation, and the world of high school politics was certainly full of both. But Melanie knew she could persuade her sister. After all, Alyssa had always trusted her instincts, and Melanie trusted hers. The next step was clear. Melanie would need to find a way to approach Alyssa and convince her to play a dangerous game. But she had to do it carefully, to make sure Alyssa understood the stakes. This wasn't just about taking down Blakely for the sake of it, it was about creating a space for people like Melanie, who didn't fit the mold of the typical academy student, to thrive. It was about leveling the playing field. As the days went on, Melanie's resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been cast aside, for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And with Alyssa by her side, she was ready to make a move that would change everything. The game had shifted, and now, it was Melanie's turn to play. The secret plan. The days that followed marked a turning point in Melanie's journey at International Academy. After the conversation with Claire and Mia, she could no longer ignore the reality of what was at stake. Blakely's facade of invincibility was crumbling, and for the first time since she arrived, Melanie began to see a clear path forward. But to take full advantage of this opportunity, she needed help, and the one person who could help her was none other than Alyssa, her identical twin sister, who was everything she wasn't. Alyssa and Melanie had always been close, despite their differences. Growing up, Alyssa had been the outgoing, bold one, while Melanie had preferred the quiet, introspective life. Where Alyssa thrived in social situations, making friends effortlessly, Melanie was the observer, more comfortable in the background. It was a dynamic that had worked for them their entire lives. They had always balanced each other out. But now, in this high-stakes battle against Blakely, Melanie needed her twin's outgoing nature more than ever. Alyssa was the perfect candidate to infiltrate Blakely's inner circle. With her charm and ability to adapt to any environment, Alyssa could navigate the complex social dynamics at play and gather the information Melanie needed to take Blakely down. Melanie's plan wasn't just about attacking Blakely head-on. That would play directly into her hands and feed her sense of control. Instead, she needed to dismantle the very foundation Blakely's power rested upon, her loyal friends and the social system that had allowed her to thrive unchecked for so long. Blakely's grip on the academy was not as solid as she thought, and Melanie was going to exploit every crack she could find. But convincing Alyssa wasn't going to be easy. Alyssa had always steered clear of drama. She hated the idea of getting involved in any form of manipulation or subterfuge. She believed that people should be able to succeed on their own merits, and she hated the idea of playing games for personal gain. It wasn't that Alyssa didn't care about Melanie, quite the opposite. Alyssa had always been fiercely protective of her sister. But the world they now found themselves in was unfamiliar, a dangerous place where social dynamics were as critical as intelligence and hard work. That evening, Melanie found herself pacing in their shared dorm room, rehearsing what she was going to say. Alyssa was at her desk, flipping through a fashion magazine, her casual demeanor belying the weight of the conversation about to unfold. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken understanding that something big was coming. Alyssa sensed it too. "Alyssa," Melanie began, her voice steady but filled with an underlying urgency, "we need to talk." Alyssa didn't look up from her magazine, but she sensed the seriousness in her sister's tone. She closed the magazine slowly and turned toward Melanie, her bright blue eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's going on?" Alyssa asked, setting the magazine aside. "I've been thinking," Melanie began, choosing her words carefully, "about how we can take down Blakely." Alyssa raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of disbelief and surprise. "Blakely? Seriously, Mel? You're not seriously suggesting we get involved in her mess, are you? You know how she works. The last thing we need is to draw attention to ourselves. This is her world, and we're just trying to get through it. If you make a move against her, you'll be painted as the enemy." Melanie took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She knew Alyssa was protective, but this was bigger than that. She had seen the cracks in Blakely's empire, and she wasn't about to let her sister's reluctance derail everything. "I get it, Alyssa," she said, her voice softening, "but this is more than just about us. It's about everyone who's ever been pushed aside, everyone who doesn't fit into Blakely's perfect little world. People like us, people who want to be here for the right reasons, are getting overlooked. We can't just let her continue to manipulate everything. She's not invincible, Alyssa. She's vulnerable." Alyssa studied her sister for a moment, her expression hard to read. Melanie could tell she was grappling with the idea. Finally, Alyssa let out a heavy sigh, her shoulders relaxing. "Okay," she said slowly, "I'm listening. But I need to understand what you're asking of me. What exactly do you want me to do?" Melanie leaned in, her voice becoming more focused. "I need you to get close to Blakely's inner circle. You're the perfect person for this, you know how to read people, you know how to charm them. Blakely's friends are starting to have doubts about her. They're already questioning her. I want you to get close to them, find out what's going on behind the scenes. And then we make our move. We expose Blakely for who she really is." Alyssa looked skeptical but intrigued. "You want me to get in with her friends? Pretend to be on her side?" Her voice was tinged with uncertainty. "That's not exactly my style, Mel. I don't like pretending, and I don't like playing games. I don't want to be involved in whatever power struggle you've got going on." Melanie knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew it was the only way to bring Blakely down. "Alyssa, this isn't just about playing games. This is about showing people that intelligence, honesty, and integrity matter more than the superficial world Blakely has created. You don't have to pretend to be someone you're not. You just need to give them a little nudge, help them see what they've been blind to. They're scared of Blakely, but you're not. You can show them what it's like to have someone on their side for once." Alyssa looked away, clearly weighing the situation. She had always preferred the straightforward route, the one where everything was clear-cut and honest. But Melanie's words were persuasive. She wasn't sure she agreed with every part of the plan, but she understood why her sister was so determined. "All right, fine," Alyssa finally said, her voice resigned but firm. "I'll do it. But I need to know that this is the right thing to do. If I'm going to put myself in that position, I need to trust that you're not just doing this for revenge." Melanie nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I swear to you, Alyssa, this isn't about revenge. It's about exposing the truth. Blakely's been getting away with it for far too long, and people deserve to know what's really going on. We'll do this together." Over the next few days, the plan began to take shape. Alyssa, with her natural charisma, began to spend more time around Blakely's inner circle, easing her way into their social dynamics. She started showing up at the same parties, joining them at the cafeteria, and even engaging in casual conversations during class. It wasn't long before Blakely, in all her vanity, began to take notice. Blakely's friends, who had once eyed Alyssa warily, now saw her as someone who could be trusted. It was hard not to like Alyssa. Her warm smile and friendly demeanor made her the perfect person to infiltrate their world. To Blakely's inner circle, Alyssa was just another student looking to make her mark. But beneath the surface, she was learning things, gathering information, and sowing the seeds of doubt. As Alyssa subtly encouraged conversations that leaned toward questioning Blakely's behavior, Melanie watched from the shadows. She wasn't sure exactly what Alyssa was learning, but she could tell that cracks were beginning to form in Blakely's carefully constructed walls. The more time Alyssa spent with Blakely's friends, the more it became clear that Blakely's reign was beginning to waver. Melanie's quiet revolution was taking shape, and she was finally starting to see the possibility of a new world, a world where intelligence, integrity, and loyalty could triumph over manipulation and control. The game had shifted, and now, Melanie and Alyssa were playing it on their own terms. The days of quietly watching from the sidelines were over. It was time to take action. The game unfolds. As days bled into weeks, the delicate web of influence around Blakely began to unravel in ways no one, least of all Blakely herself, could have anticipated. While Blakely continued to sit at the apex of the Academy's social structure, her control over her friends and allies started to weaken. Alyssa had done her job expertly, slipping into the tight-knit circle of Blakely's followers with ease. She had shown them a side of loyalty and strength that had been missing from Blakely's world, all while gently nudging them to see the flaws in their blind adoration for her. But Melanie knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was still ahead. Blakely had to be exposed, not just in front of her friends, but in front of the entire Academy. The influence she wielded didn't just come from her friendship with a few select students, it was deeply ingrained in the Academy's culture, from the teachers who respected her authority to the other students who bowed to her social prowess. It would take more than a few whispered conversations to tear down the empire Blakely had spent years building. The plan, now set in motion, had grown far more intricate. Melanie knew they couldn't afford to make a misstep. Alyssa, though still uncomfortable with some of the tactics, had begun to see the fruits of their labor. The more she spent time with Blakely's friends, the more their skepticism grew. They were starting to see what Alyssa had suspected all along, that Blakely's kindness was a performance, a facade, carefully crafted to maintain control. It wasn't just the students who had begun to question Blakely's authority. The teachers, too, were starting to notice. Despite Blakely's charismatic presence in the classroom, there were murmurs among the faculty. It was becoming apparent that Blakely wasn't just a leader among the students, she was actively influencing the way things ran behind the scenes. The school had long allowed her to call the shots in everything from the cheerleading squad to the selection of academic committees, but the more students like Alyssa began to speak up, the more cracks appeared in the foundation of Blakely's influence. One afternoon, as Melanie sat in the back of the library, buried deep in her notes, she overheard a conversation between two of Blakely's closest friends, Mia and Claire, who had begun to distance themselves from their once untouchable leader. "I'm telling you, Claire, I don't think I can keep pretending anymore," Mia was saying, her voice filled with frustration. "Blakely's been acting so distant lately. She doesn't care about any of us, she only cares about herself and keeping her position. I don't even know why I'm still following her." Claire sighed, her voice quieter, filled with uncertainty. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing. But she's so powerful, Mia. Everyone's afraid of her. What if we're making a huge mistake by questioning her? What if everything falls apart if we stop following her?" "But it's already falling apart, Claire," Mia replied sharply. "Can't you see it? Blakely is cracking under the pressure. She's not invincible anymore. We need to make a choice, keep going along with her lies or step up and do what's right." Melanie couldn't believe her ears. The seeds of doubt had sprouted, and they were beginning to spread like wildfire. The longer Alyssa spent gaining their trust, the more vulnerable Blakely became. This was exactly what Melanie had been waiting for, this moment where the facade would collapse. But even with everything beginning to fall into place, Melanie knew that she couldn't afford to act hastily. They needed to expose Blakely at the perfect time, when all of the Academy would be watching. The plan would take patience and precision. Alyssa, sensing the growing tension within Blakely's inner circle, began to subtly accelerate her efforts. She became more vocal in her conversations with Mia and Claire, allowing her frustration with Blakely's behavior to seep through just enough to spark more questions. Meanwhile, Blakely remained blissfully unaware of the rebellion growing within her own ranks. She was too confident, too caught up in maintaining her image, to see what was happening under the surface. One afternoon, just after lunch, Alyssa came to Melanie's dorm room, her face flushed with excitement. She was practically vibrating with energy, her eyes shining with a mix of exhilaration and anticipation. "Melanie, it's happening," she said breathlessly. "Mia and Claire are finally starting to talk. They're beginning to see it. Blakely isn't the person they thought she was. I can tell they're ready to make a move, but we need to be careful. If we push them too hard, they might back off, and we'll lose our window." Melanie nodded, her mind already racing. The timing was critical. It was no longer about simply gathering information, it was about using that information to stage the perfect confrontation. She knew the next few days would be pivotal. If they moved too quickly, they could risk exposing their plan and losing everything they'd worked for. But if they waited too long, Blakely might figure out what was happening and strike back before they could act. "I've been thinking about this," Melanie said, her voice steady. "We need to set up a moment where the entire school will witness the truth about Blakely. It can't just be a small confrontation, we need to make sure that everyone sees her for what she really is. When she's exposed, it needs to be undeniable." Alyssa raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in her expression. "What are you thinking?" Melanie smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. "I've been watching Blakely, and I've noticed something interesting. She has a huge fundraiser coming up in a few days, the one for the cheerleading squad. It's the one event that always draws the entire academy. All of the students, the teachers, everyone will be there. It's the perfect opportunity to confront her. If we can get Mia and Claire to back us up, we'll have enough support to turn the tide." Alyssa's eyes widened. "You want to confront Blakely in front of the entire school?" "You're right, it's the perfect time, but do you think we'll have enough proof? We've only gathered rumors and whispers so far." Melanie was already 2 steps ahead. "We don't need proof in the way you're thinking. Blakely's biggest weakness is her need to be in control, to have everything go according to her plan. We'll set her up. We'll create a situation where she has to reveal her true nature in front of everyone. Once she does, no one will be able to ignore it." Alyssa paused, thinking it over, before nodding slowly. "Okay, I get it. But we'll need to move fast. This could blow up in our faces if we're not careful." The days leading up to the fundraiser were filled with intense planning. Melanie and Alyssa worked in tandem, using their unique skills to prepare for the showdown. Alyssa continued to infiltrate Blakely's inner circle, pushing just enough to ensure that Mia and Claire would be ready to act when the time came. Meanwhile, Melanie focused on gathering support from other students who had quietly grown tired of Blakely's control. The night before the fundraiser, Melanie and Alyssa met in their dorm room, finalizing their plans. "This is it, Alyssa. Tomorrow, we make our move. We can't let Blakely dictate our futures anymore." Alyssa looked at her sister, a flicker of excitement and fear in her eyes. "Let's do it. Let's show them all what we've been fighting for." The next day, as the academy's students gathered for the fundraiser, Melanie could feel the electric charge in the air. This was the moment. Blakely was hosting her annual gala for the cheerleading squad, an event she had been planning for months, and she had worked tirelessly to ensure everything went perfectly. The entire academy would be there, teachers, students, even alumni. There was no better stage for Melanie's plan to unfold. The fundraiser began with Blakely in the spotlight, greeting the attendees with her signature smile, greeting everyone as though she were the undisputed queen of the academy. But behind the scenes, Melanie and Alyssa knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. As Blakely stepped up to the podium to give her speech, Alyssa caught her eye from the back of the room. It was time. With one last nod to her twin, Alyssa stepped forward, her voice cutting through the crowd as she began to speak, her words poised and deliberate. The school's eyes were on her. "I think it's time we all had a little chat about what's been going on behind the scenes," Alyssa said, her voice clear and unwavering. The final confrontation. The tension in the room was palpable. The fundraiser had been a carefully orchestrated event, and as Blakely took the stage, she was brimming with confidence, the center of attention, the epitome of grace and authority. But Alyssa's voice had cut through that atmosphere like a bolt of lightning, shaking the air with its force. The academy, all of its students, teachers, and influential alumni, had all gathered under one roof, waiting for this moment to unfold. What started as a carefully calculated disruption was now escalating into something that no one could ignore. Alyssa stood near the back of the room, her stance firm as she spoke with an almost unnerving clarity. Her words echoed against the polished walls of the grand hall, drawing the attention of every single person present. "It's time we all faced the truth," Alyssa's voice rang out, steady and unflinching. "There's a lot of talk about loyalty, about friendship, about success. But what does that really mean when one person's success comes at the expense of everyone around them?" Melanie, hidden in the crowd, watched the scene unfold with a sense of awe and a surge of pride. Alyssa was perfect in this role, her natural charm, confidence, and effortless presence captured the crowd's attention. As Alyssa's words sliced through the silence, Melanie could see Blakely's posture stiffen, her smile faltering for just a moment. There was something about Alyssa's commanding presence that unsettled Blakely. She had been the one in control for so long, the one who dictated the flow of social life at the academy. But now, someone else was questioning that power. Blakely's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance flashing across her face as she scanned the room. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain as she turned to the crowd, trying to regain control of the moment. "Who dares to question the event of the year?" Alyssa didn't back down. Instead, she stepped closer to the center of the room, her gaze unwavering as she met Blakely's eyes. "I think we all know who's been pulling the strings here. But maybe it's time we ask ourselves, what kind of leader uses fear and manipulation to hold power? What kind of leader can't handle a little bit of honesty?" The room grew still. The murmur of voices faded, replaced by a charged silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Blakely, now visibly rattled, gripped the podium in an attempt to steady herself, but it was clear she was losing her usual composure. This wasn't the scripted event she had prepared for. This wasn't the show she had been used to performing. Alyssa continued, her words growing more resolute with every passing second. "Blakely has played us all for fools. For too long, she's convinced us that her popularity, her power, and her success were the only things that mattered. But she's been hiding something. She's been manipulating everyone in this room, twisting the truth to suit her own needs." The crowd, once skeptical, was now leaning in, caught in the magnetic pull of Alyssa's conviction. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances, while some teachers who had been oblivious to the internal politics of the academy began to take notice. Melanie could see the tide turning in their favor, slowly but surely. Blakely tried to regain control, her voice sharp and cold. "This is preposterous. You think you can come in here and just..." She stopped herself mid-sentence as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Alyssa wasn't alone. From the back of the room, Melanie stepped forward, her presence silent but undeniable. She had always been the quieter twin, the one who preferred to watch from the sidelines, but today, she was no longer content to be passive. It was her turn to speak. "Blakely," Melanie's voice was calm but unyielding, "you've spent years convincing people that you hold all the power here, that your control over this school is unchallenged. But I've watched you. I've seen how you've manipulated students, made them fear you, and used your charm to control everything. And I've had enough." The room seemed to breathe in unison as Melanie's words hung in the air. Blakely's eyes darted toward her, a mixture of disbelief and fury flashing across her face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be the one in control, the one everyone admired. How had Melanie and Alyssa turned the tables so completely? "You think this is some sort of game?" Blakely sneered, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything I've built? You're nothing." Melanie didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering. "I'm not trying to destroy anything, Blakely. I'm trying to expose the truth. You don't get to tear people down just because you're afraid of losing your position. You don't get to control everyone just because you're scared of what might happen if you lose." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Blakely's facade began to crack. The smooth, polished exterior she had carefully cultivated for years was crumbling, and everyone could see it. This wasn't the untouchable queen they had all been following. This was someone who had been living in fear, someone who had used others to protect her fragile sense of power. Mia and Claire, two of Blakely's most trusted friends, were standing near the front of the room, their faces unreadable. But as the confrontation unfolded, Melanie noticed them exchanging glances, their skepticism now turning into something else. Doubt. They were beginning to see what Alyssa and Melanie had been saying all along. They were beginning to realize that Blakely's reign had been built on lies, not strength. For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of the truth settling over everyone. It was a turning point, a moment where the Academy's carefully constructed social hierarchy began to shift, where the students who had been too afraid to speak out started to question everything they had accepted as reality. Blakely stood frozen at the podium, her face pale, her eyes flickering with a mix of rage and disbelief. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've worked too hard for this. I'm not going to let you take it all away." But Melanie could see the cracks in her resolve. Blakely was no longer the confident, untouchable leader she had been just hours before. She was unraveling, and the Academy was watching her fall from grace. Alyssa stepped forward, her voice calm but powerful. "Blakely, the truth has always been there. You've just spent so much time hiding it from everyone else that you forgot to hide it from yourself. You were never the leader you claimed to be. You were just the person who kept others in line through fear." As the last words left Alyssa's lips, a ripple of realization spread across the room. The students who had once idolized Blakely, the ones who had followed her without question, were beginning to wake up. They were seeing the leader they had put on a pedestal for years not as someone to be admired, but as someone who had exploited their trust for her own gain. Blakely's chest heaved with emotion, her eyes searching the crowd for support, but none came. One by one, the students and faculty began to turn away from her, no longer willing to accept the carefully crafted image she had worked so hard to maintain. The final blow came when Mia and Claire, once the most loyal of Blakely's friends, stepped forward. Mia's voice broke the silence. "It's true, Blakely," she said, her tone regretful but firm. "You've used us. We've all been blinded by your control. But not anymore." Claire, who had been quiet up until this point, nodded. "We were afraid of losing our place, but we can't keep following you if it means losing our integrity. This isn't right." The room fell into a hushed silence, as the weight of those words sank in. Blakely's empire, her hold over the school, was crumbling. The truth had come to light, and there was no going back. Blakely stood motionless for a long moment, her eyes filled with tears of frustration and rage. Finally, she turned on her heel, her pride and dignity shattered in an instant. Without another word, she stormed out of the room, leaving the Academy forever changed. In the wake of Blakely's departure, there was a shift at International Academy. The students who had once been under her thumb now stood tall, their voices no longer silent. They were free to make their own choices, to lead with integrity and intelligence, not fear and manipulation. The power dynamics had shifted, and the academy had become a place where the truth could no longer be silenced. Melanie and Alyssa stood together at the center of the room, their eyes meeting with a shared understanding. This battle had been won, but their journey was far from over. They had exposed the truth, broken down the walls of power, and shown everyone that integrity and honesty were the true forces that could change the world. And as the crowd began to disperse, their whispers of awe and admiration growing louder, Melanie and Alyssa knew one thing for certain: they had taken back their future. Together, they had created a new world, one where truth always triumphed.